This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
The invitation to deliver this lecture came as a great honor to me. I'm delighted to join this vibrant intellectual community for a few days, and I'm humbled in knowing the distinguished individuals who have preceded me as Jefferson lecturers. Preparing for this presentation gave me an opportunity to reflect upon and to understand better some activities that have engaged me over the last several years. And it also provided me a chance to be a historian again. Thank you so much for that. I have enjoyed that part of it immensely. In 2005, I did visit Bethesda Naval Hospital, and I spent some time in the ward with young Marines who have been injured in Iraq. After a few more visits to Bethesda Hospital and to Walter Reed, I became more involved in helping the American Council on Education establish educational counseling for them. These activities, in turn, allowed me to relate with other veterans programs, such as the effort to establish a stronger GI Bill. And as I encountered groups and individuals looking to support veterans, I was always struck by the tremendous reservoir of affection, gratitude, and support for the troops and the veterans in this country. As support for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan declined, support for the troops who were engaged in those wars seemed to increase. This pattern seemed sharply at odds with the Vietnam experience. This lecture affords me an occasion to share some of my reflections and understandings about the historical treatment of veterans. In this presentation, I would like to describe some of the assumptions and the conflicts that frame the history of veterans affairs in the United States. I will summarize the historical record of support for veterans, and I will share some reflections about changes in the dominant public attitude toward war veterans, the change from those who served in Vietnam to the present veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. One point I would like to make at the outset: this lecture is not going to assess American foreign policy, nor the causes and justifications for wars. Nor is this a military history. At least it is not a military history in any conventional sense. And finally, my focus on American war veterans and their casualties is taken fully cognizant of the fact that there are non-U.S. casualties, and that these, notably the civilian ones, need to be acknowledged. War is a violent and a cruel human exercise, and can often be quite indiscriminate in its reach. My subject today is really the U.S. war veterans, who have served as part of a mobilized force, drafted or otherwise called up for a declared or an undeclared war. For most of our history, the United States military has been in a peacetime state, and those who have served in these forces have been volunteers. Military forces during wartime, on the other hand, historically have been conscripted, drafted, or called up to duty from militia or reserve units. They have been the much celebrated citizen soldiers of the United States. Last August, at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention, President Obama said of the legacy of support for American veterans, quote, "America's commitments to its veterans are not just lines in a budget. They are bonds that are sacrosanct, a sacred trust that we are honor-bound to uphold." In November, the United States Supreme Court seemed to affirm this commitment when it ruled in the case Porter versus McCullum for a new hearing for a Korean War veteran who had been convicted of a 1987 murder. The court held that the defense had not presented evidence of the psychological state of the veteran as a result of his war experiences. The justices noted, quote, Our nation has a long tradition of according leniency to veterans in recognition of their service, especially for those who fought on the front lines. Now, I would defer to others to debate sacred or legal obligations to veterans, but I would suggest that the history of our relations with veterans is a more complicated, it's a less generous, it's a more ambiguous than these observations from the President and the justices of the court would imply. From the very beginning of this republic, in revolutionary rhetoric and in legislative provision, those who established a new nation expressed an aversion to the idea of professional or of standing armies. This was one of the issues that led to the revolt against the Crown, after all, and the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord ennobled the American ideal of the citizen soldier. As it turned out, the widespread discomfort with the idea of a standing army also provided some practical budget advantages for the young nation, for armies and navies are expensive things. And the citizen soldier offered a political supplement to the constitutional checks on the declaration of war. It was a widely shared and enduring assumption that in a democracy, no war fought by the citizens of that democracy can be sustained unless there is clear popular support for the commitment and for the cost. This was consistent with an abiding principle of American democracy, civilian control of the military. The ideal of the citizen soldier was a crucial element in debating the decision in the 1970s to end the draft and to move on then to an all-volunteer force. And in recent years, most proposals that I have seen for a reinstatement of the draft have focused less on military requirements and have been based on the assertion that such a system would provide a more significant popular check on military activities. The assumption was that if all of our sons and daughters faced the possibility of being engaged in armed conflict in Iraqi villages and the Afghanistan mountains, perhaps no sons and daughters would face this exposure. Or if they did, there would be a full discussion and acceptance of the national interest that required this. The debate about the composition of the military obviously informs broader views toward veterans, but my question is really a simple one. What does a democracy owe to its veterans following their wartime military service? This simple question does not have a simple answer in practice. Prior to World War II, the prevailing view tended to be that this country owes little to those discharged war veterans who were physically fit. As citizen soldiers, as beneficiaries of the compact of democracy, their service was not a contract for which further compensation was due, but rather was the necessary obligation of citizenship in a free society. Clearly, this view of no compensation for healthy veterans has not been the prevailing one for the last 75 years. The GIs of World War II were cultural heroes, and they came home to a grateful nation. This reframed the dominant view of veterans' benefits. Yet it is important to note that even prior to World War II, there were major exceptions to the principle that there was no obligation to healthy veterans. The passage of time has always been important in the development of public affection for and even mythologizing of wartime service. Surely a grateful republic embraced the Revolutionary War veterans, but in the early years of this nation, it was but a quick embrace, as the new nation and its citizens had much work to do. Within a few years, however, the celebration of the historic revolution and those heroes now who fought it became an important ritual of national unity. The pattern of support for veterans that evolved following the revolution would frame the fundamentals that would mark our policy down through the First World War. Support for widows and orphans of those who died in combat action. Some limited support for combat-related disability, and it was largely limited in the early years. Selective land grants down through the 1850s, and for Revolutionary War and Union Civil War veterans, pensions for aged survivors. The First World War was a war of citizen soldiers. Conscription drew broadly from the population as the military forces increased in 18 months from approximately 125,000 to nearly 4 million serving by November of 1918. President Woodrow Wilson and the Congress provided a war risk insurance plan for active duty military personnel who had to pay their own premiums. There was an initial expectation that this, along with the health care for injured veterans, would be sufficient, but it proved not to be adequate. It proved not to be adequate in many cases to provide for the transitions back to civilian life. Even though World War I individual veterans' benefits were limited, the magnitude of the numbers who served in the armed forces and who required medical support was consequential. In the 1920s, about 20% of the federal budget went to veterans. And in 1921, in response to the need of veterans, Congress institutionalized veteran support with the creation of the Federal Veterans Bureau. This was the source of some of the embarrassing corruption during the Warren Harding presidency, and in 1930, the agency was reorganized as the Veterans Administration. Within a few years of the end of the war, many of the veterans who had not required any of the medical treatment or disability-related help were increasingly of the view that they should receive some benefits in compensation for their service. Economic problems in the United States and the world encouraged this position, and in 1924, the veterans achieved, over President Calvin Coolidge's veto, passage of a bonus to be paid them in 1945. By the early 1930s, many sought early payment of this bonus as a result of the Great Depression, and a group of veterans organized as the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus Army, and they marched on Washington to lobby and to protest. In the summer of 1932, President Herbert Hoover ordered General Douglas MacArthur to remove them physically from their encampment in Washington. He did this by using tanks and tear gas to expel them. This entire experience was an embarrassing one for the United States, and the government's desire to avoid a repeat of any such confrontation was an important part of the policy consideration for the comprehensive veterans programs that were provided at the Second World War. The Serviceman's Readjustment Act of 1944, known simply as the GI Bill, was a program that fundamentally shifted the nation's treatment of war veterans. This comprehensive legislation provided for all veterans, including the able-bodied, and was passed by the Congress prior to the conclusion of the war. It expanded traditional medical and disability programs, but also provided for a substantial investment in the transition of the veterans back into American society. The legislation provided for up to 52 weeks of unemployment benefits. It established an interest-free loan program for the purchase of homes, farms, or businesses, and it offered a comprehensive and generous plan to support education or training for veterans. As with earlier veterans legislation, the GI Bill provided medical support, but this one set a new standard with an investment in healthy veterans. It was not without its flaws, however. There were political calculations involved in the passage of the legislation, and there were instances of fraud in the administration of benefits, as pointed out by Berkeley historian Kathleen Friedel in her thorough analysis of the political context and the full consequences of the GI Bill. Nevertheless, it seems clear that the provisions of the GI Bill encouraged and helped underwrite much of the creative energy that American society experienced following the war. The education provisions of the GI Bill stand, I believe, with the civil rights movement and the women's rights movements in expanding the system of American higher education so that it became a model for access and for democratization. Within a few years, veterans comprised nearly half of the students enrolled in American colleges and universities. The GI Bill was more than a compensatory handshake, a gratuity, for the citizen soldiers of the global war. It built upon New Deal programs, and one of the goals of the GI Bill was to ease the demobilization of a military force of nearly 16 million men and women. The GI Bill was the largest entitlement program up until that point in American history. Social Security would soon surpass it, but it had not yet done that. In the several years following the Second World War, the Veterans Administration had the largest number of employees of any government agency, and in 1950, 71% of federal payments to individuals went to veterans through the various veterans programs. The public generosity toward war veterans in the 1940s would not be sustained at the same level even in the next decade. In the Cold War years and in the major post-war economic and social adjustments, there are a number of competing budget priorities, and there were concerns about some of the allegations of fraudulent claims under the GI Bill. In establishing programs for Korean War veterans and then Vietnam War veterans, the government increasingly scaled up military service requirements for eligibility and scaled down levels of support, including reduced unemployment benefits and loans. And by the Vietnam period, the benefits simply did not even cover full educational costs. It is revealing that no one really questioned the basic assumptions of the GI Bill, even as they scaled back its coverage. The educational benefit came to dominate. The principle had been established that a grateful nation owed to its wartime citizen soldiers compensatory support that would enable them to pursue an education in order to advance their lives and to pursue their ambitions. Future debates would be over the details, not over the principle. Additionally, there was broad acceptance of policies and programs that provided for medical and other support for veterans from discharge to death, and the medical support was not restricted simply to service-connected disabilities. Other veterans could meet eligibility standards for VA health care. Vietnam veterans, of course, faced a nation divided in its support for the war, which for some at least meant a lessened sense of gratitude for those who served in the war. Even though there have been unpopular wars historically, there really was no precedent for a significant public sentiment that blamed those called to fight in those wars. The nature and the unpopularity of the Vietnam War did not noticeably influence the traditional programs for veterans, other than the reduced coverage that followed the post-World War II pattern. On the other hand, there was at best a slow, even a grudging acceptance of responsibility for some newly identified and newly understood consequences of combat service. The government denied for many years the medical effects of weapons such as Agent Orange, despite compelling and tangible evidence of this powerful herbicide defoliant's residual malignancies. In 1991, following years of litigation and medical claims, the Department of Veterans Affairs agreed to consider Agent Orange a presumptive factor in a range of cancers and other conditions. And only in the last few years, literally in the last few years, has there been any acknowledgement of responsibility for the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange. One estimate I saw was that 400,000 Vietnamese died as a result of diseases, of cancers that they picked up from Agent Orange, and there are another 500,000 birth defects as a result of this. And we have just in the last few years assumed some responsibility for that. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the psychological malignancy, was also rejected in the immediate post-Vietnam years as a medical condition. Traditional accounts of battle fatigue and of shell shock were as old as warfare. In the Civil War, it was called soldier's heart. There was a resistance to recognizing this as a chronic illness, with even some of the older veterans groups dismissing complaints as a whine that Vietnam veterans needed to move beyond. Finally, in 1979, the Congress authorized the Veterans Administration to provide counseling for those suffering from PTSD symptoms. It was the 5th time such legislation had been introduced in the Congress when it was passed. This followed shortly after the American Psychiatric Association had recognized this as a clinical condition. This was faster and easier than Agent Orange because of the tremendous liability issues that were involved with the latter, including liability issues from some of the major drug companies, the major chemical companies that manufactured these products. The post-Vietnam programs of support for veterans were comprehensive and they were expensive, none of which presumes their adequacy in meeting the needs of veterans. In 2000, the year 2000, the Department at cabinet level since 1988 was the largest federal agency outside of the Defense Department, the Department of Veterans Affairs. Over 20% of the federal non-defense personnel worked for the VA, and this expense was largely politically protected from cost-cutters and critics. In fact, in the spring of 2001, a Pew survey learned that only 3% of respondents favored a reduction in spending on veterans programs. The Gulf War in 1990-91, Operation Desert Storm, had further enhanced the climate of public support for the military and for veterans. The military effectiveness of the troops fighting in those wars strengthened the image. And the 9/11 attacks, of course, underlined this climate of support for the military with an emotional jolt. There have been few events in American history that elicited such widespread fear, resolve, and national unity as did the 9/11 attacks. If the U.S. military had little role to play on that fast-moving morning, it emphatically would soon. It quickly became apparent that these attacks were initiated by the militant Islamic fundamentalist group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. This group had been provided sanctuary and training sites by the Taliban government in Afghanistan, and there was strong public support for the U.S. militarily to strike back. The U.S.-led NATO attack in late 2001 easily toppled the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the rapid defeat in the early spring of 2003 of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, considered then a co-conspirator in international terrorism, one who allegedly was emboldened by weapons of mass destruction in his arsenal. This only increased the popular acclaim for the professionalism and the courage of the American military. And this acclaim never really lessened, despite serious opposition to the rationale for the war in Iraq at the outset, opposition which increased in the following months as there turned out to be no weapons of mass destruction. But support for those serving the military never wavered. Surely there were political calculations involved in this. Many learned from the Vietnam experience that it was not only unfair to blame the warriors for the war, but it was also politically inexpedient to do so in this era of acclaim for those who served. There have been few public sports or cultural events in the last several years where servicemen and women have not been saluted. Magnetic ribbons and bumper stickers on automobiles, lapel pins, and refrigerator stickers all attest to this support. Businesses, corporations, and not-for-profit groups elbow with each other to pay homage to this generation's armed forces. And communities across the United States have bonded in celebration of local units departing for the Middle East and have waited on the tarmac to embrace their return. And too often, the routines of life have been altered as entire communities pause to thank and to mourn those whose sacrifice was forever. But national celebration and individual grief do not necessarily result in the delivery of support. As these wars prove more complicated than they appeared when they began, it should not be surprising that some needs of those who served have gone unmet. There was a national wake-up call to this situation when two reporters for the Washington Post broke a story in February 2007 regarding deplorable conditions for outpatients at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. 10 days ago, I visited Bethesda Naval Hospital. It was my 20th visit to one of our major military hospitals. And I have to say, on all of these occasions, I have never met anyone with responsibility for serving patients, military or civilian, medical or support personnel, who was not fully committed to doing all that they could to comfort and to heal the patients and to support their families. But the record also affirms that they have not always had the capacity or the facilities to meet their objectives. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have gone on much longer than anyone predicted in 2001 or 2003. The resistance in those countries have proved more durable, more effective, and deadly than nearly any official projections made at the outset. As a result of this, our forces have been pressed with multiple tours in the hostile areas, and as their equipment has been pushed too hard and sometimes has proved inadequate to the demands of the theater, so too have the support systems domestically been strained. Hospitals and medical support facilities and VA transitional and ongoing services have faced unprecedented demands and numbers, unexpected demands and numbers. And no one in 2001 or 2003 had predicted wars of this length, nor had they planned for casualties of this magnitude and medical needs of this complexity. In addition to the duration of the wars, the unexpected need for medical support for wounded veterans has resulted from two other factors, both positive developments, but with real consequences. One has to do with the efficiency and the effectiveness of modern battlefield medicine, and the other has to do with the quality of combat protective gear and its proven effectiveness in preventing some fatal wounds. In all U.S. wars prior to this 21st century, the ratio of surviving wounded to fatalities was 2.1 to 1. That is, for everyone killed, 2.1 were wounded or injured. This actually was pretty constant. In World War II, it was 2.3 to 1, and in Vietnam, it was 2.6 to 1. But in Iraq, over the period from the invasion in March of 2003 down through mid-December of last year, the ratio of wounded to killed was 7.25 to 1. We're saving a lot more of these young men and women who are injured on the battlefield. In Afghanistan, from October 2001 to December of 2009, it was slightly better than 5 to 1. Certainly, the speed and the quality of treatment are critical. Military medicine is saving young men and women who would have died in previous wars. Modern medicine has a companion piece in modern military technology. Even with all of its shortcomings, some of the military men in the audience here today can affirm that, even with its shortcomings, the body armor used in the field serves to protect vital organs from fatal damage. Modern body armor has helped prevent fatalities, but it has not protected troops from loss of limbs, from horrible burns, or from head injuries, often resulting in significant cognitive brain damage. Often enclosed in protective steel vehicles, our troops have been subject to major explosions, resulting often in serious burn injuries and major concussions. As of 1 year ago, there were 1,286 combat veterans with amputations, and down through 2007, there are 43,779 traumatic brain injuries. Their hospital stays are lengthy, with requirements for sophisticated treatment, state-of-the-art prostheses, multiple surgeries, and extended physical and occupational therapy, all of which has often exceeded the capacity of the hospitals. I would add a brief personal observation. In my hospital visits over the last 4.5 years, I always go room to room and bed to bed, and I talk there to the wounded veterans. And I have always asked them what happened to them, and they're always quite willing to talk about it. Of the whatever 150 to 200 patients with whom I have spoken, they describe snipers and mines. A few of them have talked about mortars fired from a pickup truck behind a berm someplace. They talk most commonly about improvised explosive devices. hidden under the road or under a bridge, sitting in road trash, perhaps a suicide bomber in a car or in a crowd. I expect at most a half a dozen of these wounded veterans have told me that they saw the person who attacked them. The Iraq War has not been marked by many conventional firefights or battlefield engagements where the U.S. military clearly can dominate. There generally has been a strong political commitment to address the issues of the wounded veterans, and for several years this clear resolve was absent, though, in another of the major post-World War II veterans programs, the GI Bill for Education. In 1984, Congress had approved the Montgomery GI Bill. This peacetime program was restricted in terms of eligibility, and the benefits were often inadequate. Remedies proved politically complicated. The sharp divisions that marked discussions about remedying shortcomings in the Montgomery program were somewhat surprising to me. The GI Bill, after all, was the celebrated symbol of a successful veterans program. The surprise is lessened, however, when we consider the immediate context, both the nature of the all-volunteer military and the nature of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. With a force that was pushed hard by frequent deployments, with a mission that had become complicated and nuanced, and with technology that was increasingly sophisticated, the military needed trained, experienced personnel. If too many men and women left the service following their initial enlistment in order to enroll in school or a training program, there could be major personnel problems. The tension between veterans' benefits and military requirements was really largely unprecedented. Previous wartime benefits were either part of a demobilization process, as they were at World War II and Korea, or of an engagement such as Vietnam that was sustained by the draft and draft-induced enlistments to maintain personnel goals. Re-enlistments had always been critical to maintain experienced non-commissioned officers, but in the all-volunteer force they became even more critical. In the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Pentagon had no draft to increase the pipeline of recruits. Within a few years after the 9/11 surge in enlistments, enlistment and re-enlistment goals were challenged by the nature of the war and the optional opportunities in a growing economy. The Army especially was straining to meet its enlistment goals. Senator Jim Webb of Virginia, a decorated Vietnam Marine veteran, Marine officer, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Navy, and accomplished novelist on the Vietnam War, introduced legislation in January 2007 to provide current veterans with educational benefits roughly equivalent to those of the Second World War. Officials in the Pentagon projected some significant re-enlistment problems that would result from this expanded GI Bill. And so during debate over this proposed legislation, the Defense Department and the White House publicly opposed the bill, and they were joined by a number of congressmen and senators. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates insisted that any enhanced benefits program need to contain the option of transferability so that military personnel who re-enlisted and who served a minimum number of years could transfer the benefit to a spouse or a child. Advocates of this believe that such a provision would provide a means to stay in the service and still utilize the benefits. I might even make re-enlistment more attractive. So the Webb bill, with the transferability amendment, was approved by Congress and signed by President Bush in June of 2008. In the fall of 2009, over 180,000 veterans enrolled under the provisions of the new GI Bill. But the entire debate over the legislation signaled a major shift in the way many policymakers and government officials regarded veterans' benefits. In addition to being a service bonus from a grateful nation, this now was considered a personnel tool in the task of managing the modern military. With this overview of official veteran policy historically, I would like to turn now to an intriguing question that is unresolved. As I engaged for this purpose in researching the history of veterans' benefits, one thing increasingly stood out to me: the difference in attitudes toward the current generation of veterans as compared with the reception of the Vietnam War veterans in the late 1960s and 1970s. Clearly, the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq, and more recently, the war in Afghanistan, have not had sustained popular support. Yet the servicemen and women who have served in our current wars have been warmly welcomed and thanked for their service. And the Vietnam veterans largely came home to neither welcome nor thanks. As Max Cleland, Vietnam triple amputee and head of the Veterans Administration, one-term United States Senator from Georgia, Riley observed, he and the veterans never had a ticker tape parade, and instead they were treated as, quote, co-conspirators in some escapade with sinister overtones. Tim O'Brien, the accomplished novelist and Vietnam veteran, wrote in Going After Cachito, they did not know even the simple things, a sense of victory or satisfaction or necessary sacrifice. They did not know the feeling of taking a place and keeping it, securing a village, and then raising a flag and calling it a victory. Those who have served in wars other than Vietnam generally recognize that their fellow citizens did not always consider what they had done as heroic. Neither did they reject it as criminal. In the case of Vietnam, the opposition to the war was often expressed in pretty sharp rhetoric. This was about more than a mistaken policy. Daniel Berrigan's sense of being, quote, morally outraged and ashamed had a resonance in this country. And when a distinguished journalist such as Anthony Lewis referred to the 1972 bombings of Hanoi as a crime against humanity, it was hard not to include the airmen as among the criminals. The culture of the 1960s was marked, of course, by young people of military age revolting against the conventional and affirming values of love, brotherhood, and sisterhood. Surely, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez assuring that the times they are a-changin'. Country Joe and the Fishes, I feel like I'm fixing to die, challenge. And John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance plea. These mirrored as they also shaped a generation's and an era's sense of revolution and of resolution. Demonstrations at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago and the acoustic cultural manifesto at the Woodstock Festival in 1969 stood as symbols of the time, symbols that were in sharp contrast and counterpoint to all that the military in Vietnam seemed to represent in terms of culture and values and goals. In his compendium of accounts of returning veterans, Bob Greene included many reports of veterans being spat upon at airports, being called baby killers on the streets. Some have challenged the veracity of these reported incidents, but as one veteran wrote, if the number of spitting incidents are inflated, it doesn't change for a minute the feelings of rejection and scorn that a bunch of depressed and confused young men experience when they returned home from doing what their country told them to do. The Defense Department has estimated that over 3.5 million Americans served in the military in Vietnam. There are 47,424 battle deaths and 10,785 other deaths in the country. There are over 150,000 wounds that did not require hospitalization and over 153,000 that did, some of them quite significant hospitalization. This was a major and a costly war, but as the purpose and the origins came under question, so did those who were fighting it, as did their sacrifices and the sacrifices of their comrades. The anger and emotions, the defensiveness and the moral judgments of this volatile mix should never be minimized. Public perceptions of the war in Vietnam have been influenced by events during the war and by coverage of them, by disclosure of the horror of My Lai, the photo of Vietnamese General Lone executing a Viet Cong officer, the small Vietnamese girl and others around her, clothes burned from their bodies, fleeing from napalm. In 1971, Gallup reported that 50% of Americans polled believe that incidents such as the atrocity at My Lai were, quote, common occurrences in Vietnam. Lewis Harris reported that 81% of his respondents believed that there were, quote, other incidents like My Lai which had been unreported. Of course, we now know that there were other incidents, none of the magnitude and the horror of My Lai, but there were. And what happened is that the incidents themselves became commonplace in the minds of many. And Lieutenant Calley of the Americal Division, rather than the boy next door of World War II, became to many critics the symbol of the military in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was in America's living rooms. Television footage was far more timely and graphic than were World War II newsreels. And correspondents in Vietnam had far more independence than did their predecessors, or indeed their successors in Iraq and Afghanistan. They covered the war in ways that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan surely are not being covered today. In February 1968, there were 636 accredited correspondents in Vietnam. They had pretty free movement throughout the theater. The tragic images of war and accounts of its complexities became part of American life, and a military restriction became critical here. These correspondents were not allowed to show photos or images of American troops being killed or having serious wounds, so it was not possible to sympathize with them. Instead, the footage was of the Vietnamese, who were horribly ravaged by this war. And some veterans of the war came home and confirmed incidents that they observed or even participated in that were morally indefensible, or at least at best morally ambiguous. In the minds of many, there was a heavy burden of guilt, or at least doubt, placed quite unfairly on all who served, who were the baby killers. Now, in a comparison filled with ironies, perhaps the greatest one is that those who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan have volunteered for military duty, yet they have been celebrated for serving in unpopular wars. In Vietnam, the draft served to fill enlisted ranks, and the threat of the draft encouraged enlistments. The unwilling, or at least the unenthused, found themselves criticized for answering the call to military duty. Draftees paid a heavy price for this. In 1965, 28% of the soldiers killed in Vietnam were draftees, and by 1969 it was 62%. But the draft was not the great leveler that it promised to be. The historian Christian Appy studied the casualties in Vietnam and determined that the combat forces there were perhaps the youngest in U.S. history. As he noted, thus most of the Americans who fought in Vietnam were powerless working-class teenagers sent to fight an undeclared war by presidents for whom they were not even eligible to vote. If this led to some sense of unfairness and injustice on the part of the combat troops, it did not necessarily lead to a bonding with anti-war protesters, with the Vietnam veterans against the war being an obvious counterexample. In fact, many veterans came home from Vietnam with mixed feelings about the war and its conduct. Some significant numbers of them were openly critical, but they did not easily make common cause with the anti-war movement. Nonetheless, reconciliation did come. Even as for many veterans the scars remained, President Jimmy Carter's decision to extend amnesty to all draft resistors helped to move beyond that divisive issue, though in the short term it served to harden the views of those who viewed this group as heroic on the one hand, and those who considered them as traitors on the other. By the late 1970s, President Carter was reminding Americans that it was crucial to separate the warriors from the war and to honor the patriotism and courage of those who had served in Vietnam. He insisted that they deserved to be treated better than as an unfortunate or embarrassing reminder of the divisiveness of the war itself. President Ronald Reagan rekindled some divisions when he described the Vietnam War as a noble cause, but he backed off from that somewhat by focusing subsequently on the need to honor the veterans. By the late 1970s, public opinion polls affirmed a far more positive public attitude toward the Vietnam veterans. President Reagan played an important role in restoring the credibility of the military. This was important to him strategically, politically and personally. He and Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger oversaw better compensation for active duty military personnel, and the Reagan rhetoric consistently evoked gratitude for those who served. This found a responsive audience and a bipartisan chorus. Few Democrats were eager to challenge the President on this ground. The Vietnam Memorial in Washington would prove to be an important symbol of remembering, honoring, and reconciling, even if in its formative years it too got caught up in significant and emotional debates over the design and over the message. The focus and the discipline and the commitment of Jan Scruggs, who had been wounded while serving in the Army in Vietnam, were critical for this process. He never once lost his focus on the need to have the memorial. He and a group of committed veterans and supporters navigated through the political divisions that Vietnam still engendered. Scruggs believed that reconciliation could only follow remembering, and he quoted from Archibald MacLeish, "We were young, we have died, remember us." And I'm just delighted to have Jan Scruggs in the audience today. Jan, I admire so much all that you've done. Thank you for being here. The Veterans Day 1982 homecoming celebration welcoming belatedly Vietnam veterans and a ceremony formally dedicating the wall provided examples of the ongoing divisions from the war. Those who sought a more heroic memorial continue to be frustrated that the wall did not have any traditional statuary. The Frederick Hart statue of 3 infantrymen had not yet joined Maya Lin's wall. There was also concern from some groups that the anti-war veterans movement had too much influence over the celebration. This apprehension caused President Ronald Reagan finally to decline to appear at the dedication ceremony, although he did come over with Mrs. Reagan to the National Cathedral, where they read the names of all of the 58,000 over 3 days. They read the names of each of the people who have been killed in Vietnam. This proved to be an occasion when reconciliation truly began. But as often seemed to be the case regarding Vietnam veterans, the process surely was different. Columnist Mary McGrory wrote of the Vietnam Veterans Celebration, quote, "Naturally, they had to organize the homecoming parade themselves, just as they had to raise money for their wall, just as they had to counsel each other in their rap centers, and just as they had to raise the cry about Agent Orange." Now, the contrast with today is sharp. As was the case with Vietnam, many Americans, if they believe that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are mistakes, they've challenged those engagements and their advocates. But unlike 40 years ago, the troops who have engaged in these current wars have avoided being drawn into the controversy, except as positive references and as allies, as both supporters and critics of the wars affirm their interest in protecting the safety and the honor of those who have served. It is intriguing that the dominant image and rhetoric today invests in the all-volunteer force, all of the imagery of the celebrated citizen soldiers who were called up to fight our wars historically. In fact, in today's military, only the National Guard and Reserve units who are mobilized for combat tours really fit this historic model. In fact, last year's Jefferson lecturer, the distinguished historian David Kennedy, called the current military a mercenary force. He insisted that this was not pejorative, but he was concerned about the consequences of not having some form of draft that would make the military more representative of our society. There is a professionalism that marks the armed forces today, partially a deliberate and disciplined military leadership response to the perception of the state of the military during the Vietnam era. The high level of training, the focus on accomplishing goals and minimizing casualties, the sophistication of modern military technology all serve to advance more professional armed forces. And the demographics of the armed forces have changed from those of the Vietnam era. Active duty personnel, as compared to 1973, have an older age, an older mean age. They are more female. 2.2% of the military in 1973 were women, and 20% in 2007 were women. The military today are significantly more likely to be married. In fact, in their age group, they're more likely to be married than is the civilian population of their age group. They're more likely to have a high school diploma than others of their age group. They're less likely to come from the northeastern states. They are less likely to be white, with a change in this profile coming from increases in Hispanic and Asian members of the military. A recent study determined that 75% of those killed in Iraq were white. In Vietnam, the figure had been 86%. The median age of the Iraq dead was 24 years. In Vietnam, it was 21. The troops killed in Iraq tend to be more middle class or lower middle class in background than representative of the poorest income areas. This may largely be a reflection of the medical standards and education minimums required for enlistment today, and the fact that the poorest families have the lowest health profile and the poorest record of completing a high school education. Public opinion polls affirm support for the military. In the early 1970s, 27% of the public had a great deal of confidence in the military, lagging then behind confidence in institutions such as medicine, universities, organized religions, and major companies. By the turn of the century, 44% of the public had great confidence in the military, more than any of the civilian institutions in the United States. The professional image of the all-volunteer force does influence current public attitudes toward the military, but it also reinforces a somewhat abstracted, even video game perspective on combat activities. Scholars such as Richard Cohn and Andrew Basovich have commented that military action has become nearly the equivalent of a spectator sport. As Professor Cohn has suggested, war has become an all-purpose metaphor for any proposed initiative, and I would simply suggest that it's a trivialization of something that should never be thought of as trivial. The United States may indeed have many political divisions today, but President Obama had no challenges when he said in his State of the Union message last week, as he said to those in uniform, "Americans are united in sending one message. We honor your service, we're inspired by your sacrifice, and you have our unyielding support." We have come a long way from the revolutionary generation's belief that the nation owed nothing to healthy veterans, and from the bonus army protest encampment. And indeed, we have come a long way from Vietnam veterans being marginalized or worse. We need to remember always, in our democracy, under our Constitution, the military does not start wars, they fight them on our behalf and at the direction of our political leadership. Wars are not pretty things. This past December, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates spoke to U.S. troops stationed near Kirkuk in Iraq. He said, quote, "One of the myths in the international community is that the United States likes war. And the reality is, other than the first 2 or 3 years of World War II, there has never been a popular war in America." Now, one could debate some elements of the Secretary's assertion, but in fact, I think it is largely accurate. And I would further observe that this is a good thing. While wars may sometimes be necessary, and while wars surely need to be supported in order to be sustained, it can be a dangerous thing if war becomes popular. But this leads us to a different subject, a terribly important one. I shall not ask us to take that on now. It is relevant, though, to this concluding thought. Those who serve at risk on our behalf should never again feel that the gratitude of the Republic for their sacrifice is dependent upon the popularity of the war that we have asked them to fight. Thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you.
I'm a Vietnam veteran and came home with what later on was being described as post-traumatic stress disorder. What I found helpful was actually a Buddhist meditation practice from the Theravada tradition. And I now host a sitting group that has a lot of veterans in it. And I was conversing with an Iraq veteran about the differences in the experience of our homecoming. And we acknowledged the kind of distinction that you just made. And he said, yet at the same time, I feel a little weird sometimes when people express their gratitude to me for the service that I rendered. He was a 50 caliber machine gunner on armored vehicles. He said, if those people really had any idea at all of what I saw and what I actually did, they may not feel quite so grateful. Yeah. And it makes me feel weird. I'm just wondering if you have any comment about that.
No, I think that certainly I've talked to a lot of veterans, and then some of them are trying to wrestle through and deal with some of the things that they observed. And I think that there's just no doubt about that. I think that there's far greater discipline and control in the military today than there was in Vietnam. Vietnam was just a different sort of theater. It was hard to have, I mean, right now most of the military in Iraq and Afghanistan are on specific posts, and they go out from those posts and they come back to them. You're not having people out on patrol for 30, 40, 50 days, although sometimes in Afghanistan they are. I have to correct that, but by and large they're not. And I think that they're just a far greater discipline today. But obviously, they're facing moral dilemmas. I'll tell you, one of the most powerful conversations that I had, and it really says something about war, was with a young man who had been with a unit that was, and this was in the spring of '03 at the time of the invasion, going into Iraq, and his unit came under, they're all in vehicles, in Humvees, and they got fire from a farmhouse, and they started in a firefight with some people in the farmhouse, and this guy saw a little boy run out of the farmhouse and get caught in the crossfire and go down. And they finally silenced the people in the farmhouse, and this guy jumped out of his Humvee and ran out in this dusty courtyard, as he said, and there was this boy gasping and clearly was going to die. He had serious wounds, and he wasn't going to live very long. And his sergeant back in the Humvee said, "Get over here, get your ass over here. They're coming over the hill, we got to get out of here." And this guy said, "I know that I was putting my unit at risk, but I decided I didn't want this boy to die without somebody holding him. I wanted him to know there was a human being holding him when he died." And so I stayed right there kneeling in the dirt, and this young boy died. And then I went over and got in the Humvee, and the sergeant was quite upset with me because there were some more people coming. He said, "I'm going to have you court-martialed. You disobeyed an order, you put us all at risk." And he said it was fair enough. I did do that. Fortunately, somebody up the line said, "Let's let this one pass," and they didn't do it. But this is an awful thing. War is a terrible thing, and this is an awful sort of decision to ask a 19 or a 20-year-old to make, and we just have to recognize that.
Well, please join me in thanking President Wright for a very thought-provoking lecture.
Thank you.